Good morning. My name is Ammar Abdulhamid. I'm a Syrian dissident. In September of 2005, I was forced to leave my country for criticizing President Bashar al-Assad. In exile, I've lived in Washington with my loving family, my wife Khawla, our daughter Ola, and our son Muhannad. Together, with help of our friends here and in Syria, and with funding from the Middle East Partnership Initiative, a program initiated by President George W. Bush, we launched a foundation dedicated to supporting pro-democracy activists in Syria and across the Middle East. We worked hard at developing the leadership skills of young men and women who, from depths of despair and oppression, were trying to stitch together activism networks. These networks were dedicated to raising awareness about both democracy and the practice of civil disobedience. The aim was to hold government accountable to the will of the people. Hard work finally began to pay off when people all across Syria, inspired by developments in Tunisia and Egypt, rose up against the corruption and oppression of the Assad regime. The movement was peaceful and inclusive. The cross and the crescents were held high. Arabs and Kurds, Muslims and Christians, Sunnis and Alawites all demanded a transition to democratic governance. In response, Bashar al-Assad showed he was just a common thug. To hold power and keep his fortune, he ordered troops supported with tanks and heavy artillery to attack peaceful demonstrators and death squads to assassinate reformers. In little over a year, 15,000 people have been killed, 80,000 are languishing in jails, and more than 250,000 have become refugees. The international community has done little to help the Syrian people. But it is still our hope that world leaders will be compelled by their conscience and by their national self-interest to act, to end this tragedy, and to bring Syria freedom. The stories of dissidents highlighted in the Freedom Collection can help motivate international policymakers to do the right thing. The collection also helps oppressed people break the barrier of fear and the wall of silence that descends under autocratic rule. The collection shows that freedom advocates are not alone. Others went before, and their stories teach where success lies. It's not easy. While the price of activism is sometimes the death of the human body, the price of silence is always the death of the human spirit, and that is a far greater price to pay. Protesters in Syria and around the world draw inspiration from President George W. Bush. During his administration, President Bush personally met with more than 180 pro-democracy and human rights activists, independent journalists, and family members from 35 countries. He initiated programs that inspired, informed, and trained thousands of young freedom advocates across the Middle East and North Africa, many of them now in leadership positions in their changing countries. And upon leaving office, he founded the George W. Bush Presidential Center, dedicated to improving the human condition throughout the world, with a strong emphasis on unleashing freedom in nations like Syria. As he said in his second inaugural speech in 2005, the best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you. Please be seated. Ammar, thank you for your kind words. All of us here today join you in hoping and praying for the end of violence and for the advance of freedom in Syria. Now, let me thank each of the dissidents and democracy advocates who've joined us for your example of conscience. We honor your sacrifice, we celebrate your courage, and we will support your struggle for as long as it takes. I want to thank all of you for attending the Washington launch of the Freedom Collection. I actually found my freedom by leaving Washington. But it's good on occasion to be back and to see old friends. I want to thank those who work for the Bush Foundation in Dallas. Mark Langdale is the president. I thank Jimmy Glassman, founding director, and all those who work for the Bush Institute. I want to thank the Yushenkos for joining us today. Victor and Katerina, we're honored you're here. Thank you for your leadership of the Orange Revolution. Members of Congress who join us, we appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule diplomatic corps, thank you for being here, and members of the Bush administration, the mighty Bush administration. Thanks for showing up. These are extraordinary times in the history of freedom. In the Arab Spring, we have seen the broadest challenge to authoritarian rule since the collapse of Soviet communism. Great change has come to a region where many thought impossible. The idea that Arab people are somehow content with oppression has been discredited forever. Yet we've also seen instability, uncertainty, and the revenge of brutal rulers. The collapse of an old order can unleash resentments and power struggles that a new order is not yet prepared to handle. Freedom is a powerful force, but it does not advance on wheels of historical inevitability. And it is history that proves this point. The American Revolution of 1776 produced George Washington, who embodied the democratic habits of a new nation. The French Revolution of 1789 eventually produced Napoleon, who set out to conquer Europe. The outcome of a freedom revolution is determined by human choices and the creation of durable democratic traditions. Some look at the risks inherent in democratic change, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, and find the dangers too great. America, they argue, should be content with supporting the flawed leaders they know in the name of stability. But in the long run, this foreign policy approach is not realistic. It is not realistic to presume that so-called stability enhances our national security. Nor is it within the power of America to indefinitely preserve the old order, which is inherently unstable. Oppressive governments distrust the diffusion of choice and power, choking off the best source of national prosperity and success. The hoarding of power leads to cronyism, corruption, inefficiency, and resentment. This is the inbuilt crisis of tyranny. It fears and fights the very human attributes that make a nation great: creativity, enterprise, initiative, and responsibility. Dictators can maintain power for a time by force and by feeding resentments toward enemies, internal or external, real or imagined. But eventually, in scarcity and mediocrity, their failure becomes evident. In every nation, a few eyes open first. It is dissidents who see the shabby reality of oppression and refuse to live any longer with lies and humiliation. They show defiance and courage and stubbornness. But above all, they have a genius for hope. Václav Havel said that politics is not the art of the possible. It is the art of imagining the impossible and then making it happen. From Havel to Mandela to Aung San Suu Kyi, dissidents have practiced the art of the impossible. America does not get to choose if a freedom revolution should begin or end in the Middle East or elsewhere. It only gets to choose what side it is on. The tactics of promoting freedom will vary case by case, but America's message should ring clear and strong. We stand for freedom and for the institutions and habits that make freedom work for everyone. The day when a dictator falls or yields to a democratic movement is a glorious day. The years of transition that follow can be difficult. People forget that this was true in Central Europe, where democratic institutions and attitudes did not spring up overnight. From time to time, there's been corruption, backsliding, and nostalgia for communist rule. There have been threats to independent media and civil society. Essential economic reforms have sometimes proved painful and unpopular. It takes courage to ignite a freedom revolution. But it also takes courage to secure a freedom revolution for future generations through structural reform. Both types of bravery deserve our strong support. This is now the challenge in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. After the euphoria, nations must deal with questions of tremendous complexity. What effect will majority rule have on the rights of women and religious minorities? How can militias be incorporated into a national army? What should be the relationship between the central government and regional authorities? Problems once kept submerged by force must now be resolved by politics and consensus. But political institutions and traditions are often weak, and some remain unreconciled to freedom. We know the problems, but we've also seen a source of hope. The people of North Africa and the Middle East now realize that their leaders are not invincible. They can be held to account. Citizens of the region have developed habits of dissent and expectations of economic performance. Future rulers who ignore those expectations, who try returning to oppression and blame shifting, may find an accountability of their own. Oppression depends on uninformed and inactive citizens. And in much of the greater Middle East, the era of the passive citizen is over. As Americans, our goal should be to help reformers turn the end of tyranny into durable, accountable civic structures. Strong constitutions, political parties committed to pluralism, free elections, the rule of law and property rights, hopeful economies drawn into open world markets, healthy civic institutions, protections for the rights of minorities and women. This work will require patience and creativity and active American leadership. It will involve the strengthening of civil society with a particular emphasis on the role of women. It will require a consistent defense of religious liberty. It will mean the encouragement of development in education and health, of trade and foreign investment, of people-to-people contacts. There are no guarantees, and there will certainly be setbacks. But if America does not support the advance of democratic institutions and values, who will? In promoting freedom, our methods must be flexible. Change comes at different paces in different places. Liberty often arrives not in leaps, but in steps. Yet flexibility does not mean ambiguity. The same principles must apply to all countries. As a country embraces freedom, it finds economic and social progress. But only when a government treats its people with dignity does the nation fulfill its greatness. And when a government violates the rights of a citizen, it dishonors an entire nation. One way to encourage freedom is to highlight and honor those who make it the defining cause of their lives. Laura and I had the privilege of meeting many dissidents and democracy activists at the White House. They really inspired us. And we did our best to assure them that they were not alone, that the hopes and prayers of a great nation were with them. This is also one of the primary goals of the Bush Institute. We are gathering the stories and artifacts of democratic reformers, not just to celebrate the past, but to educate the next generation. We want a young activist in Venezuela to hear Bob Fu talk of his struggle with despair. We want a Syrian dissident to learn Havel's Art of the Impossible. The Freedom Collection is a continually updated project designed to share the inspiration and lessons of great reformers and dissidents. Our goal is to provide both moral support and practical knowledge. Thomas Jefferson once wrote about the contagion of liberty. With the Freedom Collection, we aim to spread it. There's nothing easy about the pursuit of freedom. In America, we know something about this. We face challenges since our independence, protecting minorities, building a national army, defining the relationship between the central government and regional authorities. And at times, they've nearly torn us apart. It took many decades of struggle to live up to our founding promise. But we never cease believing in the power of those ideals, and we should not today. For all the difficulties, the advance of freedom remains the most powerful, hopeful trend of our time. In 1900, Not one country in the world met the modern standards of democracy, including our own. By 1950, there were 22. Today, according to Freedom House, there are now more than 110 electoral democracies. No advance of freedom is inevitable, and any gain can be lost. But there is a reason for the momentum of liberty across the centuries. Human beings were not designed for servitude. They were created for better things, and the human soul is forever restless until it rests in freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, President Bush. Good morning to y'all. That's very Texas. My name is Xiqiu Fu, and most people here know me as Bob, not a very typical English name or Chinese name. I'm the founder of China Aid Association based in Midland, Texas. In 1989, I was part of the students' democracy movement